Luxembourg, December 19th, 1944. A German staff officer stood over a map and stared at an arrow that should not have existed. 2 days earlier, General George Patton's Third Army had been driving east toward the Saar. Its supply lines pointed east. Its corps boundaries pointed east. Its artillery parks, fuel dumps, maintenance routes, and staff schedules all pointed east. Then the Ardennes exploded. German armor punched through the American line. Bastogne was surrounded. The weather collapsed into snow and ice. And now, on this German map, the same American army appeared to be turning almost 90 degrees north. Not a patrol, not a brigade, not a desperate column thrown onto a road. An army. The report said Patton's units were moving toward Bastogne with a speed that did not fit German calculations. Not risky, not ambitious, impossible. A field army in 1944 was not a chess piece. You could not pick it up, rotate it, and set it down somewhere else. It was men, fuel, trucks, ammunition, kitchen trailers, radios, bridging gear, wreckers, medical stations, traffic control points, tank recovery teams, and paper orders moving through frozen towns in darkness. It was thousands of engines depending on the next gallon of gasoline, thousands of drivers depending on the next road sign, thousands of officers depending on communications that could not go silent. And somehow, Patton's army was not breaking apart. It was gaining speed. The question inside the German headquarters was not, can they reach Bastogne? The question was worse. How are they doing this at all? To understand why that question mattered, you have to strip away the legend for a moment. Because the legend says Patton saved Bastogne by sheer will. It gives you the pearl-handled image, the hard voice, the dramatic promise at the map table. That part is real enough. But Patton did not turn a modern army north by personality. No man does. What moved through Luxembourg and Belgium in those frozen days was something larger than a commander. It was a system so disciplined, so overbuilt, and so violently practical that German officers could watch the result and still fail to recognize the machine underneath it. On December 18th, Eisenhower calls an emergency meeting at Verdun. The German Ardennes offensive had shocked the Allied front. Roads were clogged with retreating units, refugees, ambulances, artillery, and confusion. Bastogne sat in the path of the German drive, and if it fell, the enemy would gain the road hub it needed to keep pushing west. Eisenhower needed a counterstroke. He needed to know which army could turn, how much force it could send, and how quickly it could arrive. Patton came to Verdun with the answer already folded in his pocket. His staff had not waited for permission to think. General Hobart Gay and Colonel Paul Harkins had already prepared plans for a northward turn. Not one plan, but several, scaled to different levels of commitment. So when Eisenhower asked when Third Army could attack toward the Bulge, Patton did not ask for time to study the problem. He gave a date, December 22nd, 3 divisions. The room understood what that meant. Those divisions were not sitting in reserve with warm engines. They were engaged on another front, facing another direction, tied to supply lines designed for another mission. To send them north, Third Army had to loosen units from combat, redraw routes, redirect fuel, move corps headquarters, shift artillery, establish new communication nets, and keep enough strength in place that the southern front did not split open behind them. That was not simply movement. That was surgery performed on a moving body, and the body was freezing. The roads of Luxembourg and southern Belgium were narrow, slick, and crowded. Snow hid the shoulders, ice turned grades into traps. Blackout rules forced drivers to crawl through darkness behind tiny shielded lights. A single disabled truck could block a column. A single wrong turn could pour armor into a village street too tight to escape. A single missing fuel point could turn a tank battalion into steel statues before it ever heard a German gun. Now multiply that by tens of thousands. Third Army's northward shift involved roughly 130,000 men and about 30,000 vehicles moving across a road net already under war pressure. At convoy spacing, those vehicles did not form a line. They formed a country-length problem. If you stretched the whole movement nose to tail, the column would run for hundreds of miles. But the roads did not permit one neat line. They had to be braided through villages, secondary roads, bridges, intersections, fuel points, and assembly areas without choking themselves to death. That is where the miracle stops being a miracle. The Third Army had traffic police in the cold, thousands of them. Men in helmets and heavy coats stood at crossroads through the night, waving convoys through with flashlights, hand signals, and frozen arms. They did not make speeches. They did not appear in oil paintings. Most of them were never named in the stories that followed. But if they failed, Patton failed. Because the fastest armored division in the world is useless if it is trapped behind a stalled kitchen truck at a village intersection. Fuel teams moved before the main columns. They did not wait for tanks to run dry and then react. They pushed gasoline into the root system ahead of need, turning supply flow that had been aimed east toward the Saar and bending it north toward the Ardennes. Maintenance crews followed the arteries of the movement like doctors looking for clots. When a vehicle broke down, the problem was not only mechanical, it was tactical. A dead truck on an icy road could delay artillery, block ambulances, and force an armored column to halt under weather, fatigue, and enemy uncertainty. So wreckers dragged dead weight out of the way. Mechanics patched what could be patched. Drivers slept in fragments. Engines idled, coughed, froze, and started again. This was the part German calculations missed. They could calculate distance. They could estimate road capacity. They could judge weather. But they did not fully measure the American habit of building redundancy into motion. The Wehrmacht could move with brilliance when rail lines, fuel, orders, and timing aligned. It had done so again and again earlier in the war. But by late 1944, Germany was fighting with a damaged transportation system, shrinking fuel stocks, exhausted reserves, and a command process that still expected major shifts to pass through a slower chain of recognition, approval, and redeployment. Patton's move did not only outrun German vehicles, it outran German decision-making. That was the real violence of it. On the German side, the first reports looked wrong. Third Army units should not be appearing there. Not that soon. Not in that strength. Maybe the prisoners had misidentified the units. Maybe aerial observers were seeing fragments. Maybe radio traffic was deception. Maybe the Americans were bluffing. But the reports kept coming. Different sources, same direction, same impossible turn. German commanders facing Bastogne understood the danger quickly once they believed the intelligence. If Patton reached the southern edge of the pocket before Bastogne collapsed, the German offensive would lose more than a town. It would lose time. And time was the one resource the Ardennes offensive could not replace. The German plan depended on speed before the Allies could organize. It depended on surprise becoming distance, distance becoming fuel capture becoming operational momentum, and momentum carrying armored spearheads toward the Meuse. But every hour Bastogne held, every hour St. Vit delayed, every hour American pressure formed on the shoulders of the Bulge, the German timetable became less like a plan and more like a debt. Patton was not simply sending troops to a siege, he was collecting that debt early. And by the time German headquarters processed the scale of the turn, asked for blocking forces, searched for reserves, and tried to redirect units toward the threat, The American columns were already farther along the road than the German response had been designed to meet. That is what made the movement so unnerving to professional soldiers. It was not only fast, it was fast in the one way that destroys an opponent's ability to think clearly. It made decisions expire before they could be executed. Then came the second shock. The units arriving from Third Army were not wrecked by their own speed. That was supposed to happen. In war, speed usually charges interest. A force that moves too fast arrives tired, scattered, short of fuel, low on ammunition, and mechanically damaged. The march becomes its own battle, and the arrival is only half an arrival. But the formations moving toward Bastogne were still able to fight. Not perfectly, not comfortably, not without cost. But they arrived as combat formations, not as wreckage. That was the part German officers could respect and hate at the same time. Because a forced march is easy to order. A functional arrival is hard to build. The 4th Armored Division became the visible spear point of the relief effort, but even that phrase hides the work behind it. An armored division is not just tanks. It is tank crews, half-tracks, artillery, engineers, medical units, fuel trucks, ammunition trucks, maintenance companies, radio sections, map teams, liaison officers, and cooks. It eats roads. It drinks gasoline. It sheds broken vehicles like scales. To move it fast in winter and still have it strike at the end required planning down to the unglamorous inch. Where does this battalion refuel? Which road is strong enough for this weight? Who clears the bridge? Where do the artillery columns pause? How do the radios reach the next headquarters? Which intersections get military police? Which village becomes a bottleneck if refugees keep moving through it? Which unit leads when the first German roadblock appears? This is why the famous promise at Verdun was only the visible edge of the blade. Patton could promise speed because his staff had already built the routes in their heads. His staff could build the routes because the army had the trucks, radios, fuel, and officers to make routes matter. And the army had those things because the United States had turned industrial abundance into operational method. Not just more stuff, better movement. There is a difference. More tanks can still sit uselessly if the fuel does not arrive. More trucks can still jam a road if nobody controls the junctions. More ammunition can still fail a battle if it is stacked in the wrong place. More radios can still produce chaos if no one has built the net. What Third Army showed in December was not abundance alone. It showed abundance organized into motion. Inside Bastogne, the men of the encircled garrison were holding under artillery, cold, and uncertainty. Their stand would become one of the defining American stories of the war. But from the German operational point of view, Bastogne was also a clock. Could the town be reduced before the relief force arrived? Could the road hub be seized before the southern flank hardened? Could the offensive keep moving west before the Allies gathered themselves? Patton's turn changed the answer. The first attacks north did not magically break the siege in a single rush. The final approach was hard, ugly fighting. German armor and infantry resisted. Terrain and weather slowed everything. The link-up with Bastogne came on December 26th, after days of pressure and blood. But the deeper damage had already been done. The German timetable had been compressed. The southern shoulder of the Bulge no longer looked open. Forces that were supposed to exploit the breakthrough now had to worry about protection. Fuel meant for forward movement was consumed in reaction. The great offensive began to feel its own weight. By early January, when the Allies launched the larger counteroffensive to squeeze the Bulge down, Germany's last major reserve in the West had been spent in a gamble that no longer had the fuel, men, or time to complete itself. The Rhine waited beyond that, and the same army that had turned north in December would soon be moving east again. That is why the map in that German headquarters mattered. It was not showing one dramatic rescue. It was showing a change in the basic rules of the campaign. The Germans had planned against a response measured in weeks. They got one measured in days. They had expected an army to need time to turn. They met an army designed to pivot. History likes commanders because commanders give history a face. Patton had the face. He had the voice. He had the nerve to say yes, while other men were still calculating no. He deserves his part of the legend. But the real lesson of Bastogne is bigger and colder than legend. It is a military policeman at a frozen crossroads, keeping one more column from taking the wrong road. It is a fuel officer canceling yesterday's plan and building tomorrow's route before the ink dries. It is a mechanic lying under a dead truck in the snow, because that truck cannot be allowed to become the reason a battalion arrives late. It is the staff officer redrawing supply lines in a tent so cold that paper, hands, and machines all seem to resist him. It is a driver following a blackout lamp through an icy village, knowing only that the road ahead is north and the convoy cannot stop. These were not the moments that look heroic from a distance. They were the moments that made heroism possible. The German staff looked at Patton's turn and asked how an army could do it. The answer was not hidden in one man's courage. It was hidden in every unglamorous part of the system that moved behind him. The map showed arrows, but the arrows were only the surface. What Germany was really watching was a nation's logistics, discipline, industry, training, and command culture turning together in the dark. Patton did not merely drive north. Third Army changed direction faster than the enemy could change its mind. And in that winter, on those roads, that was enough to break the last German gamble in the West.